Nikki Fogden-Moore, the Mojo Maker, and welcome back to the show. We have a whole new series for you, and as part of the influencers and people who do things with Live campaign, it is no greater pleasure than mine to introduce the infamous Jamie Pride. Jamie, thank you.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
It's pretty exciting. We've just had lunch, so we've philosophized about the whole world, and we've also done a recording for your show, Failure Proof, this morning.
That's correct.
And that is a brand new show of yours that has come out. And tell me a little bit about Failure Proof.
So for me, one of the most important factors that I think entrepreneurs need to develop in terms of skill is this idea of resiliency. And the fact that you will experience failure in your entrepreneurial career, that's very sort of par for the course. However, a lot of entrepreneurs don't prepare for that failure appropriately. And so for me, it's very much around, rather than sort of saying I'm going to avoid failure, it's about failure proofing yourself. So how do you develop, one, resiliency, and secondly, how do you build a sustainable work practice over time?
And what you will notice is that we're sitting in almost like a university-esque backdrop because we're sitting in the New South Wales Startup Hub. Is that correct?
It is.
And which is a pretty cool location. I feel like I'm walking through university. Jamie feels like he's right at home. And the reason why he's just finished one of his first books, well, actually, the second book, isn't it?
Second book, yeah.
Unicorn Tears. And I think the great thing about Jamie is that you are absolutely dedicated to making sure that entrepreneurs have the best start, so that founder fitness mentality. And I met Jamie many, many years ago, I would say 2 to 3 years ago, standing on stage talking about your own journey and extreme success, and then having it all come crash down. So just for listeners and viewers that are tuning into the show today, whether you're in the States or whether you're in Europe or you're selling in Australia, I'd love you to hear a little bit about what your background is. So.
Yeah, look, I've had a bit of a mixed career. So I worked in the corporate world for a long time for large American organizations, primarily in technology. So I worked for companies like Cisco Systems, for Red Hat, a software company, for Salesforce.com. Spent a lot of time abroad, so I spent some time in Australia, but most of my corporate career was spent either in Singapore or in London. And I came back to Australia after I had some children to lead realestate.com.au, which is probably, for those who aren't based in Australia, it's one of the largest digital publishers. It's about a $6 billion business. So I was a very young CEO and spent some time sort of developing my, leadership in that role. Was fortunate enough to be offered a partnership at Deloitte post that role. And I moved back to Sydney to lead the Deloitte digital practice. During that time, though, I was always an entrepreneur at heart. So spent my side hustle days looking at businesses I could start. One of those businesses happened to be a Salesforce.com integrator, and myself and a couple of co-founders, built that business into a very substantial services business with some IP and some product over the top. And we sold that business in 2012 to a US based company that was private equity backed, a company called Blue Wolf. So as a result of that, I made a full-time move out of the corporate world and into venture capital. And so since then, I've spent probably the past 5 or 6 years either acting as an entrepreneur and founding businesses or funding them, or a blend of both. And so I'm constantly sort of surrounded by startups or entrepreneurs or my own businesses now, pretty much 24/7.
And I think the interesting thing as well is you've just launched the Founder Circle, which is really this creative and intellectual hub for people that are entrepreneurs to come and feel part of the tribe and deal with all those issues around resilience, growth, determination, even working through numbers to marketing strategy, because you knew there was a huge gap in the market to provide support mentally, physically, emotionally, and intellectually for people that wanted to run a sustainable, and let's just hang on that word a little bit, because one thing you and I both agree on is sustainable success.
Yeah, and look, we've got a number of for-profit businesses. So, we've got our venture fund, we've got our founder lab, which is looking at, founder education. But one of the things we wanted to do that we were really passionate about, myself and my co-founder, was looking at founder mental health. Looking at peer support, looking at isolation. We were, dismayed by what we would call numbing out, burning out, or checking out, the sort of the 3 big challenges that entrepreneurs were facing. A lot of drug and alcohol abuse, a lot of depression, anxiety, and even suicide. So founders are 2.5 times more likely to be hospitalised than the baseline population. They're 3 times more likely to have depression. They're 6 times more likely to have ADHD. And really, we didn't see any outlet for founders to be able to deal with those issues and to sort of have a safe space where they could be vulnerable. And so we created a not-for-profit called the Founder Circle, whose mission is really to have founders support founders. And we sort of have this catch cry where we don't really care about your startup, we care about you. A lot of founders really heavily link their personal identity and self-worth to their business.
Exactly.
Yeah. And they don't have that separation. And the businesses can be all-consuming. However, sometimes it can just completely consume the entrepreneur. And so, when their businesses are up, entrepreneurs are up. And when their businesses are down, entrepreneurs are down. And really down. And we wanted to start a dialogue around, sustainability and entrepreneurship.
And I do want to add to this point, it's while you're explaining that, I think there's a lot of people that are leaders inside, what I call entrepreneurs, also feeling that exact same tension that when the business is up, they're up, and when the business is down, as CEOs and executives, they're really, really defined by that. So even though you've got the Founder Circle as a non-for-profit, there's a reason in your own story that you went through your own checkout, burnout syndrome as well, and so you have personal experience in this area, and I think there's a real openness about how you've spoken about that. And the big thing for me in talking with leaders is this whole attitude towards we must look after our mental health while we're on the journey to success. So how was that experience for you, if you want to share your story a little bit? Motivated you to create a bigger platform?
Yeah, look, I think that it is applicable definitely to executives just as much as it is to entrepreneurs. And, if I look at the mentality that I had when I was in the corporate world, just as when I had as an entrepreneur, it was very much one of sprinting. So, my view is that anybody can do high intensity work at short bursts. And, we tend to have what I would call this sort of escapism cycle where you kind of go, okay, I'm going to go crazy for 6 weeks, get this project done, and then I need to escape. I need to take 2 weeks off, or I'm going to be sick, or even to a certain extent, I'm going to leave my job and start a cafe or whatever it is. And so we have these very unsustainable work practices. Entrepreneurs suffer from them at the extreme, but executives suffer from them as well. The epiphany for me going through my own journey of sort of success and failure was that, sometimes we get capacity and capability mixed up. And so
it's a beautiful, I think you need to reiterate that again. Capacity and capability, they're not the same thing.
They're not, and you need both. However, I would say that capability is less important. Of course you've got to have the skills, and for me that's ticket to play, and you can always continue to improve your capability. That's going to evolve over time. But capacity, for me, on 3 dimensions, so physical capacity, mental capacity, and emotional capacity, is the fuel tank, your reservoir that you can draw upon, that smooths out that journey. And it's something that, you can essentially have to help buffer you from, the stresses of the world, and really, when I had my own challenges, I had plenty of capability, but no capacity. And, and so when the challenges come and you don't have that capacity, then you're more at risk of a breakdown, you're more at risk of potentially committing suicide, you're more at risk of abusing drugs or alcohol, because you just don't have, anything to dip into.
And let's talk a little bit about that. At lunch, you said to me, Nick, I am on all cylinders. I'm firing. I'm making great split decisions. I'm really connected. And I think there's a real misconception to what I would call outward energy. So you and I are very, very energetic, driven souls. We can multitask. Our brains are active hardwires. And there's a real threat, I think, for people that think they have to be on all the time, but their capacity isn't really working. So they've stretched themselves and they're in overdrive. And that's what you got to. So how do you recognise the signs of overdrive versus just being in your flow?
Yeah, and look, I think a point to make as well is that capacity is not something you can build when you need it. You have to build it when you don't need it, right?
It's a reserve.
So you've got to make that investment. For me, a really canary in the coal mine. So an early indicator of a lack of capacity is sleep. So when I've worked with, fortunately, I've had the opportunity to work with about 650 founders over the past 18 months. One of the common threads of that sort of cohort of founders is that, a lot of people struggle with sleep. And it's a really good indicator of your health. It's a good indicator of, if you're drinking too much, you're going to sleep poorly, the quality of your sleep and the quantity of your sleep. And the interesting thing about why sleep's important is that not only is it an early indicator, but if you're not sleeping well, then it can lead to a vicious cycle where, you get up the next day, you're grumpy. So your relationships are going to suffer both at home and at work. You're certainly not going to make good decisions. Your decision making suffers, and then your creativity suffers. So
exactly.
you're not going to be doing your best work, and therefore, because of that, you're going to sleep less. And again and again and again.
There's a reason why sleep deprivation is considered torture.
Yeah.
And I think so that's one reason. And the second reason is we're not listening to our bodies, and our bodies and our minds are the greatest indicators. So having a short fuse at people, being snappy, not being able to see things properly on the screen, also just really not being in the driver's seat. So feeling overwhelmed and letting those anxiety levels, we were talking before at lunch about just you're allowed to not be perfect. So if you start to recognize your emotions are completely, giving you a few warnings, you should listen to those signals. Why do you think that people push those down? Is it vulnerability and fear of being discovered or not knowing enough?
I think it depends on where you're at. So for me, again, it comes back to whether you're in a defensive mode or an offensive mode. Now, the more stress you're placed under and the less reserves or capacity you have, you're going to be less likely to be self-aware, and you're going to have less opportunity to reflect and listen to your body or to listen to the circumstances. And so for me, again, they become I guess counterpoints to each other. If you're stressed out, you're not going to have the headspace to be able to go, actually, I'm stressed out. You tend to kind of end up bunkering down, and you bunker down further and further.
I call it the hibernation syndrome.
Yeah,
you just want to go further into trying to dig yourself out of the hole.
Yeah, and you can feel like you're under assault, right?
Yes.
And so, it's easy for people to come in and say, you've got to reflect, etc. That's impossible. So it's impossible to intervene either yourself or intervene with other people when they're in that mode, right?
Yeah, I call that survival mode.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. So you're in survival mode. I see a lot of entrepreneurs and a lot of executives in survival mode. It's a natural human behavior for us to, that kind of fight or flight, kind of a response. And so for me, the first step in, executive or entrepreneurial wellness is to take action on things like, for example, sleep and reducing the amount of alcohol you drink, and creating some space by journaling or meditation or exercise, and then that eventually gets you out of that survival mode. It allows you to
Awareness.
Take a breath, build what I think are the three core traits of entrepreneurs, which is, you need to have a sense of self-awareness, you need to be adaptable, and you need to have some resilience. And so, you can't, turn those on automatically. There's something that you need to invest in, you need to take the time, and you can't even make that investment if you're in survival mode. It's impossible.
No, and I think, and that's the whole point in the roadmap that I work with my clients with. Survival mode to seamless success means you have to go through understanding level of awareness and accountability so you can keep checking in all the time. And this is very much what Unicorn Tears is about, is why so many startups fail is because it's this instant gratification. I think with, entrepreneurialism and starting up is becoming a real buzzword. It's sexy, it's interesting. We spoke about that earlier this morning. And I said, I encourage people to earn their stripes a little bit more. We should always have innovation and creativity, and we should always have a go. Failure is important. It's where we learn. But we've also got to understand there needs to be some foundations in place that you can sustain the journey, because it's a tough road.
It is, and I mean, I love entrepreneurialism. I love startups. I love that it's democratized. So for me, the fact that it's easier than ever to start a business. It's easier than ever to participate in this part of the economy. There's a flip side to that though, right? Which is that if 92% of startups fail within the first 3 years, then 92% of founders will fail within the first 3 years, and there's a corresponding human impact to that. And whilst I think we've gone leaps and bounds in improving entrepreneurial education, and there's a lot of work out there, with the Lean Startup, which is Eric Ries's book. There's a lot of work in incubators and accelerators, and there's a bunch of information out there for entrepreneurs in terms of business model and value proposition, and I would say the technical side of starting a business. There's not a lot of conversation, and certainly not a lot of preparation for entrepreneurs on the the physical and emotional impact that what it means to doubt yourself, what it means to, fear disappointing other people, the imposter syndrome, the idea that you have a fear of, being rejected. There's a whole bunch of psychological aspects to entrepreneurialism that aren't widely discussed. And I think a lot of people think, well, that's just, you're either born an entrepreneur or you're not. And I've oscillated back and forth about that. My view is that you can actually learn and entrepreneurialism can be taught, but I think we're teaching the wrong things. I think we need to be preparing people, for that those sort of personal impacts that entrepreneurialism, takes.
And I think we spoke about this as collateral damage, and I once again, I think we need to prepare anyone in life for the tools to be able to navigate all the roadblocks and consider all these challenges with curiosity. And with Unicorn Tears, you're specifically talking about the fact that there are areas that you can build on, that resilience and adaptability, and also this I call it the pit crew. But having the conversations with people that really care and have been in those shoes, we shouldn't be afraid to ask for help. So if you're listening to this right now, I'm going to ask Jamie to say the 3 things that I know for sure when you did so well on the stock exchange and you were standing there with, Dom Perignon, and it was all going well and then it all fell through. There are certain things that we look back on and we just didn't ask for help because we didn't know how. So if anyone is listening to this and you're like, that you've got a great product, or you really love your job, and you don't have to keep pushing the envelope all the time, there's definitely a more effortless way to find your glide. So what would your 3 tips be for people that were really at this point thinking, this is just really a lot harder than I thought, and I'm on my own in this?
Yeah, I mean, so the first, look, I think that there are 3 fundamental things that all good founders have in common. And, I've had an opportunity to study a variety of founders. The first one is that the kind of core or the foundational element that I think a good founding is based on is motive. And so, what is your why? So for me, connecting with purpose is crucial. And the reason why it's crucial is that when the chips are down and you are facing adversity, you are more inclined to go the distance on projects that you're highly connected to.
Absolutely.
And I
think it will get you up.
It will,
Yeah.
and I think it's different from passion. So a lot of people say do what you're passionate about, but passion comes and goes. Passion.
Purpose
has
is your
a spark.
GPS.
But purpose is, I think, far more sustainable, and I think it's far more closer to what your values are. And so I find that founders who are authentically connected with the problem they're trying to solve, they might be trying to solve, literacy or clean water, or they might be trying to solve a particular technology problem that somebody in their family, would benefit from. But founders that are purposely connected to the problem they're solving, they're scratching an itch, are far more resilient, firstly. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think founders who invest in themselves and build capacity when they don't need it. And that's on the 3 dimensions of physical, which is, diet, exercise, sleep, and their relationship with alcohol and drugs. And the second one is mental capacity. So, what are your productivity habits? How do you?
We spoke a bit about this.
Yeah. I mean, what's your relationship with your phone? Can you do deep work? What does your concentration look like? How do you deal with interruptions? How do you make sure that you're constantly not in like productivity crisis mode? Flustered, missing
Spot
appointments.
fires.
Spot fires. Because again, if you don't have that under control, then again, you can't even create the time to invest in yourself. And so for me, mental capacity development is really important. And then lastly, emotional capacity development. So looking at, whether or not you want to meditate or you want to do critical, self-analysis, or if you want to look at things like journaling, I think it's very, very valuable. But some kind of, ability for you to reflect and create headspace, I think is really crucial. So that's the second thing. So building capacity. And then the third thing is what I would say, questioning your bias, beliefs, and bullshit. So what I would consider to be radical self-inquiry. So that's at the top of the pyramid in the sense of, once you've got the other things under control, you can start to understand why do you do the things that you do. And it's a really interesting question because most of the time we operate completely on autopilot.
Exactly.
So we sort of get up, stimulus, response, stimulus, response, stimulus, response. And sometimes you do just things without thinking. And that's actually how we're programmed as human beings. It's a survival trait. However, if you want to grow and develop, you need to firstly understand, what do you do? And just actually make a conscious effort to be more present and understand that, when this happens, I respond this way, and create a little space to ask yourself why. The ultimate goal is to understand what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are. Because as a founder and entrepreneur, you can then start to not necessarily work on your weaknesses, but amplify your strengths and then potentially surround yourself with people who can, level out your weaknesses.
I just want to touch on that point a little bit, working specifically with leaders and entrepreneurs about the strength and weaknesses thing. And I also want to come back to the deep work point. I just love that deep work because we get starved of the deep work when we get into the day-to-day regime. But, there's a whole thing is acknowledge your strengths, but I still believe that it's worth being curious and educating yourself on your weaknesses when you are running a business or you're leading a company. Don't just leave it up to the experts. Like, get informed so you can make good questions and you can brief well, and the areas that I particularly think that people need to not shy away from is don't just say I'm no good at finance and don't just say I'm no good at creativity. You have to have some level of understanding if you want to be robust in business. You curiosity. You don't have to do the work, but I definitely think if you're really serious about evolving, then you need to not just rely on everyone else. You need to be educated and start being curious about areas that you thrive in. Yep. And areas where you can bring experts in that have done due diligence in that area. They're not just, and this is the big thing, I think, with entrepreneurs where they're not taking care of their financial well-being, which ultimately is one of the biggest stress. 97% of people fail in their personal financial administration inside work environments and as entrepreneurs, and it forms the biggest stress for them. So if we're not teaching people to lean into the areas they're most afraid of, we're not going to give them better capacity and better capabilities. And so there's lots of things around that. Don't be afraid to lean into your weaknesses either, or get help around those areas.
Yeah, although I'm a bit of a contrarian on that point. I mean, I think you need to have some level of understanding. However, I think there's a real risk you level yourself out. So
you shouldn't do everything.
So I'm a believer in you don't want to average yourself down. So for me, if you're a specialist athlete and you're a great sprinter, you're not going to really take up marathon running, right?
No,
right. So
exactly.
and so you really, really work on your strengths. For me, you've got to understand what your weaknesses are for sure, but you've got to go, look, I'm a sprinter. That's what I do. So everything that I do in my life has to be focused on, training fast twitch muscle fibers. That's what I've got to do. I'm going to focus on sprinting. I'm not going to waste time doing long distance running because whilst we all run, but I'm a particular my focus is in this particular area. And so for me, it's good to understand that's what they do, and that's great. And maybe if I need to run a marathon, I can hire somebody who can run that marathon for me.
Exactly.
There's a bunch of stuff, and I need to be able to know how I can select a marathon runner. There's a whole bunch of stuff. But I think I see a lot of people misapply that concept, and they say, okay, well, I have to.
They try and be all.
Yeah, and they try and be all things. And the biggest problem I face with early stage founders is that they buy into this myth of the super founder, and this idea, which is they see people who are unicorns in their own right. So people who do have an all-rounded view, and they are just as rare as billion-dollar businesses. However, a lot of new entrepreneurs and founders believe that they have to be it all. I have to be a marketing genius. I have to be a technologist. I have to be, amazing at sales. I have to have every answer to every question that could possibly asked of me, and that ends up being a recipe for disaster. So for me, I try to say to founders, you know what, you got to understand the whole business for sure. However, you don't need to have all of the answers, and you certainly don't need to be an expert at everything. And you either want to surround yourself with a co-founder who can complement your skills, or an employee, or a team, or a board, or a sense of advisors.
And what would you say your personal mantra has been to balance your own family life? I mean, you've certainly got. I definitely think we're going to have another episode on the show. We're going to talk about some of your passion projects and the venture capital around non-for-profit and healthcare and all these sorts of things that are using your giving back kind of philosophy as well as the commercial aspect. But you're not a stranger to having collateral damage yourself. You've ended up in hospital. You had some serious health scares, and you have a beautiful family at home. So how do you navigate your drive and still really enjoy that blend, that work-life integration?
Yeah, look, I think it's hard. I think the first point is to, have overt conversations about what it means to be an entrepreneur. I think that it's tough enough if you haven't had the conversation at home about what that means, right? And certainly there are huge advantages in being an entrepreneur, with flexibility of time and location of work and potential financial rewards. That said, there are a lot of negatives, right? Which is additional stress. You may be present but mentally absent from home. You can put yourself financially at risk.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a bunch of things. But I think a lot of people don't have open conversations with. So
you've definitely had that.
Yeah, I don't think you can be successful without having that conversation, because I see, I met an entrepreneur recently who had to go home and he was telling his spouse that he just lost all the money, and was completely stressed about that. But it was clear that there was no expectation setting before that event had occurred. And so, it's shared risk, right? So, I think in any partnership you have to have, transparency around what the risk looks like, transparency around what does it mean, and, you both go in it. Because I see a lot of entrepreneurs who are pushing against their home life, and that's just added pressure. Right.
Yeah, well, 100%. And this is why I wanted to come back to this discussion, because I feel there's lots of books around how to start up and how to build a business. But you and I are dedicated to helping people how to have a life while they do this. And that we don't want them to throw the baby out with the bathwater, or we don't want marriages to fail because of it. We want people to be healthy, wealthy, and wise while they continue to follow their purpose. And, one of your things is talking to your spouse or your significant other and explaining what an entrepreneurial landscape looks like. And it's shared risk. Mm-hmm. So don't assume that your partner knows what your day was like. There's a really great adage is when you come home and someone says, "How was your day?" and you say, "Fine," there's no room for conversation. Mm. You're shutting that door down, so there's no dialogue at home because you've been talking all day at work. Mm. So that level of mutual respect is really crucial to get the support you want, because if you don't ask for what you want, you get what you're given.
Yeah, I think there are two other really important aspects to that, which is, firstly, this idea that it's really hard to take care of other people until you're taking care of yourself. So this idea, the oxygen mask analogy where, on a plane, you put your own oxygen mask on first. I think a lot of entrepreneurs, it's hard to have good relationships if you're in that survival mode, mm-hmm. right? So again, if you're in that mode, you can't burn fat in the presence of insulin, right? So if your body's, in that survival mode, then it's really hard to, you want to go home and drink a bottle of wine. You don't want to go home and have a conversation about your day, right? So at that point in time, you have to get yourself out of that survival mode. Because it has a flow-on effect into all of your relationships. Yeah. That's the first thing. The second thing, though, which was an epiphany for me, is that you need to think about entrepreneurialism over a long enough time frame. So, a lot of people defer things for the future. So, their future self is amazing, but I don't know who this future self is, right? But, this conversation of look, I'll go to the gym after I got this product release out, or I will eat well after I, do my capital race, or I'll spend time with my family, after when I buy my desert island and I've got my millions of dollars, right? The analogy for me is looking at kids' sport. So, if you go and watch a bunch of young kids playing soccer, they actually just run around the field because it's a sunny day. They go out, they're with their mates, they kick the ball around, and they don't even care about the score of the game. Half the time, they don't even know what the score of the game is, right? They're just having fun, right? Yeah. And there comes a point in time, actually, as they grow up, where they start to care more about the outcome, and they lose the sense of joy associated with playing the game. And I say to a lot of entrepreneurs, do you like what you do every day? Because I think a lot of them don't. I think a lot of them hate what they do every day. And but they do it because they go, do you know what? I'm going to work and I'm going to slog it out.
As soon as I get
because I'm going to be the next Facebook and I'm going to get $100 million and buy my desert island. Now that day may never come. And that's no life. It's so for me, you have to, what I would call, enjoy playing the game. Now, if you don't enjoy playing the game of entrepreneurship, that means all of the terrible things that happen and all of the great things that happen, but actually coming to, work in the entrepreneurial sense every day and loving the cut and thrust of, that sort of volatile environment. If you don't like that, go and work in the corporate world. James Dyson, the inventor of the Dyson vacuum cleaner, went through something like 5,000 prototypes before he got to the vacuum cleaner. So, all innovation and all good art and science is built on a foundation of, trial and error, and constantly advancing. And so for some unknown reason, I think a lot of entrepreneurs have this sense that, failure is a dirty word.
Well, I always say your ego is not your amigo. And if you
love your catchphrases.
Well, you do too. I just, you're pretty good at them. We're almost on a par. I've met my catchphrase buddy now. But what I think this is the most important thing, this element of humility and trusting your gut rather than worrying about what other people's going to think. So you've got your blurts, I'd like to do this, but, and that's where failure comes in. It wouldn't be great, but, and I think that you just have to go for it, but make sure you've got a solid foundation and lean in and learn. If you keep making the same mistakes and you're not learning, that's stupidity. That is actually the definition of insanity, to be honest. So we do know that founders need to be slightly insane. I definitely wouldn't be on the normal spectrum, I can say that. And I think you need to have an element of crazy, otherwise it wouldn't be fun.
Yeah, and look, I stole this from somebody, and I can't remember who, but this idea of that there's a big difference between hope and optimism, right? And so, you can prepare for something and be optimistic that you're going to have a positive outcome. Or you can not prepare and hope that it's going to work out, right? So, risk-taking is definitely about doing the work, right? So, completely blind, reckless approaches that end in failure deserve to fail, right? It's great. I didn't study for the exam and I failed it.
Yeah.
Well,
that's called natural selection.
Yeah, that's called Darwinism, right? And I'm like, good, right? Yeah. Clean those people out. Exactly. But when it comes to preparing, being optimistic, and saying, do you know what, I've prepared, I've done my best. We've tried. Maybe the idea is too early, maybe it's too late. Timing plays a lot in entrepreneurship, right? So you can be completely prepared and have exactly the right product, but at exactly the wrong time. And so, especially in the technology sphere, a lot of technology builds on the adoption of previous technology, and so. It's really about performing your best and really applying, a methodical, logical approach, and being optimistic of the outcome. I'm not trying to create a cult of failure. I don't necessarily like this idea of it's all about, flirting and fail fast and all those kind of catchphrases.
I hate the whole flirting thing.
Yeah,
I think that
it is the best word we have for it, but it's a bit cheesy for me.
But the other thing is have these conversations up front and don't stick your head in the sand. I think that's, to me, mentally, that we need to not only say, are you okay, but what to do next.
Yeah, and I guess question yourself in terms of start to develop that sense of self-awareness and in the interim, create a support network that can help you. So, self-awareness is something that comes over time, and different people sit on different spectrums of emotional intelligence. However, everybody can have a good support network. Yeah. People who you trust and that are coming from a really good place. So, I'm very encouraging of entrepreneurs to surround themselves with people who've been on that journey, can break the isolation that a lot of entrepreneurs feel.
And I think leaders inside organisations feel the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Leadership is often described as being a lonely sport. However, it doesn't have to be. And I think a lot of people don't embrace a level of vulnerability. There's this, I think, mythology around leaders have to have all of the answers, and that any kind of indecision or vulnerability shows weakness, and my view is it shows strength,
100%,
and it shows a level of self-confidence that I think develops over time with good leaders.
So, Jamie, where can we find you and your words of wisdom around all these things, not only in startups, but I know you've got some beautiful projects which I'll put on board. You've got a great venture capital company. I'd love you to talk just a little bit about your purpose-driven message behind that with healthcare.
No, I mean, look, we're very much focused in the seed space. So our view is that in Australia in particular, there's a lot of angel investment. There's a lot of, I think the venture capital ecosystem has developed really strongly in the later stages. It's been a late bloomer, but we're starting to see some really good funds that have sort of come into a reality here. Not a lot of investment in the seed space, which is that sort of capital that's needed right at the beginning. The first sort of what I would consider to be sophisticated money invested in a business.
And what would that be? Just give us a figure.
Yeah, it's probably up to between 100,000 and 1.5 million. Is roughly the range in terms of how much capital that I think a business typically raises at seed. But when from our perspective, we're looking to invest in, our mandate is really looking to invest in a couple of things, which is firstly, we want to invest in social impact. So not necessarily not for profit. So but businesses that have a purpose. I think I've said previously that I believe that founders who are solving a problem that they're authentically connected to. Those businesses are usually more successful because
the stickability with it.
Yeah, and then they tend to weather it. So one of the questions I often ask founders when I meet them is, why did you start the business? Like, what's your connection to the problem? Is it a business problem that you've seen when you're working in the corporate world, or when I'm always skeptical of people who go, I thought I could make money out of cryptocurrency or whatever. There's a gap in the market. I'm like,
we need a pen that sticks to your fingers.
Yeah, maybe there's a gap in the market for a good reason. However, I like to see that we like to invest in businesses that have that purpose-driven foundation. Led by a good founder that we would consider to be coachable, not because we want to run the business, but we just believe that as an early stage leader, you need to seek a lot of different opinions.
So you need to be open-minded.
You need to be open-minded. It doesn't mean that you have to take all of that.
No, but you have to not be closed down.
But I mean, like, these businesses operate at an unbelievably fast pace in a constantly changing environment. In high levels of ambiguity, and so as a startup founder, being receptive to different ideas, to being adaptable, to drawing upon the experience of a board or your investors or your team or other entrepreneurs is just going to give you an edge. That it's going to improve your chances of success. And if you're just closed-minded, and again, it's this sort of founder paradox where you've got to have all the answers, but you've got to be open-minded. You've got to fail fast, but never give up. You've got to think about the long term and the short term. I'm like, I don't know what I need to do. Like, it's there's no real map, but I think that there's some constant traits that founders need to have, and one of them is being receptive to other people's ideas.
So that's a great way to end this fantastic show and podcast with you once again, Jamie. I know that you've got deals to do and places to go here in beautiful Sydney, and you've turned the weather on today. You can find Jamie on jamiepride.com.
You can.
His books are worldwide as well, and the Founder Circle is a great place to hop online and go and visit. If you're feeling isolated and alone in your journey to build your businesses, then just you are not. The most important thing is to reach out and ask for help. And if you don't know where else to go, please leave us a comment. We'd be happy to direct you in the right spot or to answer your questions. The most important thing is have a go.
Yeah.
There's no more time in the day. We all have the same number of minutes. And we're just here to help and to make you aspire to be your personal best. You must be healthy, wealthy, and wise. There is no isolated thing. It is about having a trifecta. And as Jamie said before, you must have fun on that journey. So if you've lost your mojo and you're wondering why you're getting up in the morning, it's probably time to assess what you're doing in the first place. So Jamie, thank you very much for sharing your wisdom and also your purpose behind helping founders succeed in what is a tough landscape. So thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
You can hear more about Jamie on the vitalitycoach.com.au. Head over to Vitality Coach TV, the Mojo Maker podcast. And until next time, thanks for tuning in. We'd love your review on iTunes. We hope that you enjoy the show.
Thank you.